come now to our final lecture in this series on the solas of the Protestant Reformation. We're looking now at the overarching sola, Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone is the glory, and we've seen initially what that means, and I mentioned in our last session that the two concerns that occupied the minds of the Reformers with respect to the glory of God were, in the first instance, that we give the proper glory to God for our salvation, and then in the second instance, that we understand what it means to give glory to God in our worship. Now, it's been said by church historians that, of course, the overarching passion that Luther had that provoked the Reformation in the first place was sola fide, the doctrine of justification. And that's what provoked the firestorm initially. But when the Reformation moved out of Germany into England, into Scotland, and into Switzerland, the great Swiss reformer, John Calvin, who was really responsible for formulating the doctrines that defined historic Reformed theology. Calvin was, of course, indebted to Luther. He was Luther's junior, and Calvin had this enormous admiration for Luther. And usually Calvin's described as the father of predestination and so on, but ironically, there was nothing in Calvin that wasn't first in Luther, nothing in Luther that wasn't first in Augustine on that doctrine. In fact, Luther wrote more about predestination than Calvin did. But Calvin certainly embraced the central importance of the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And so he joined Luther in that. But it was not the defining passion of Calvin. Calvin's role in the Reformation was centrally concerned with worship. And it's to worship that Calvin was concerned about applying this principle of Soli Deo Gloria. Later on, we remember the work in Germany of Johann Sebastian Bach, who was such a genius at musical composition. And at the bottom of all of his compositions that he wrote, he marked these initials at the bottom of the page, which stood for, of course, Soli Deo Gloria. Bach self-consciously wrote his music to honor God and to elevate the glory of God in the worship of God's people. Now, again, what drove Calvin was to reform and purify corruptions that had crept into the church's worship by the time of the 16th century, particularly patterns that developed during the Middle Ages, where much attention was given to creatures. We know that in the Roman Catholic Church, for example, the use of icons and statuary was very important, and the Roman Catholic Church said that it is not proper for anybody to give worship to an icon or to a statue or anything like that. And so they said that what idolatry is idolatria, which is the worship of idols. And Rome said, we are not encouraging people to worship these statues or these idols, even though people kneel before them, light candles to them, pray to them, and all the rest. He said, what we're encouraging is idoladulia. That is, we give service to these items that we find in the church. And of course, to Mary is also not to receive latria or worship, but she is to receive hyperdulia, extreme service to honor her as Theotokos, the Mother of God. Now, Calvin said that this distinction between idolatria and idoladulia was a distinction without a difference. And he wanted to get rid of idols in any form, that we ought not to serve them or to worship them, because to serve them in fact, is to worship them. So he was very much concerned about purifying the church and its worship from the intrusion of idolatry. Calvin's also famous for saying that the fundamental sin of fallen humanity is the sin of idolatry. And he said, we are by nature idol factories. In a sense, we mass produce them. And the oldest and again most primordial sin of fallen humanity is moving towards idolatry. And let's take a look at Paul's teaching in Romans 1, where he indicates this as the case. In the first chapter of Romans, Paul, in setting up the introduction for our understanding of the gospel, talks about God's revelation of his wrath against the whole world. And the reason why God's wrath is revealed against the whole world is because the whole world is guilty of unrighteousness and ungodliness. And the particular type of unrighteousness and ungodliness that the apostle identifies is that mankind takes this knowledge that God reveals to all of us and stifles it or hinders it or suppresses it or represses it and refuses to acknowledge God or to honor God as God. Just yesterday I was doing a talk show interview from Chicago by phone, and people were calling in questions, and I got the oldest question of all: what happens to the innocent native in Africa who's never heard of Christ? Is God going to punish people for rejecting Christ of whom they've never heard? And I said, of course God's not going to punish anybody for not responding to someone of whom they've never heard. But I said, before you draw a sigh of relief, realize that Christ comes into a world that is already universally under the indictment of God, and that every human being on this planet is exposed to the wrath of God, not for rejecting Jesus of whom they've never heard, but for rejecting the Father who has manifested himself plainly to all men. This is what the apostle says. And let me just back up here where he says in verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And that truth that they're suppressing is the truth of God. Because what may be known of God is manifest, phaneros, manifestum. It's clear, it's not obscure. It's manifested in them, for God has shown it to them. And now here's where I wanted to pick it up. Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. And that sounds like a contradiction. That how can you see that which is invisible? If it's able to be seen, then it's visible. It's not invisible. But what Paul is saying is that the invisible God, his attributes, are made manifest through and in the creation which is visible. And so that by observing the creation, we see and confront the revelation of the invisible attributes of God. And he goes on to say, for his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, that is, his godness, his deity, so that they are without excuse. You see, people think that if they were born in a different culture, from a Christian culture, or they've never heard of Christ, that somehow they have an excuse that they can carry with them, a note from the teacher when they go to Judgment Day. But it won't work, because there is no excuse for rejecting the Father, because you can't plead ignorance, because the Father has manifested himself clearly, and that knowledge, of course, has penetrated into our heads, and it is effective, so that they are without excuse. Why? Now listen carefully to this. because although they knew God, see, the sin is not a failure to come to a knowledge of God. The sin is what happens after we have a knowledge of God. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God. See, the last sola to be embraced by a fallen creature is sola deo gloria. Because the basic point of our corruption is we refuse to glorify God in an appropriate and proper way. They did not glorify Him as God. I mean, so many times we talk about God and we describe Him in such a way that it's not God we're talking about. I've said to people, if your God is not sovereign, your God is not God. If you don't acknowledge the sovereignty of God, if you don't acknowledge the justice of God, if you don't acknowledge the omniscience of God or the immutability of God, then whatever God it is you are acknowledging is not God. You're not glorifying God as God. You're glorifying something less than God as if it were God. And to glorify something other than God or less than God as if it were God is the very essence of what? Idolatry. The essence of idolatry is putting a substitute in the place of God and worshiping something that is less than God as if it were God. That's what idolatry is. Well, let's listen to what the apostle says. Because although they knew God, they didn't glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed and forever. This is our most basic sin. An exchange, a swap, a trade is made. God reveals His truth about Himself. We trade in the truth and walk out with the lie. We exchange the glory of God for the glory of the creature. And that can be done in a crass way of worshiping a bee tree or a totem pole or something that we craft from our own hands, a statue or an icon, something like that. That's the crass form of idolatry. The more sophisticated creation of idols is when we do it intellectually. When we reconstruct our doctrine of God in such a way as we strip Him of those attributes with which we are uncomfortable. We reconstruct a God who is not holy, a God who is not wrathful, a God who is not just, a God who is not sovereign. And then say, well, our God is a God of love and He has no place for justice or judgment or any of those things, but He just simply is pure love and mercy and grace. That is, we take the attributes of God we like and reject the attributes of God we don't like. And when we do that, we are as guilty of idolatry as a person who's worshiping a totem pole. Now, one of the great pernicious lies about the character of God is the one you hear every day in the American culture. We all worship the same God. Doesn't matter what we call Him, whether we call Him Allah or Yahweh or Tao or Buddha. We all worship the same thing. No, we don't. No, we don't. And the scary part is that religion underscores man's guilt before God, because what is the impetus for the creation of alternate religion to the religion that God reveals in nature is idolatry. And religion, at its heart, is man-made and idolatrous, and that even happens in the Christian community. We can be religious and be idolaters at the same time if we are withholding the glory that belongs to God and to God alone. And see, Calvin understood this text in Romans. He understood how basic it was and how deeply rooted in our souls the penchant for idolatry is, and how easily we are turned aside from true worship to idolatrous worship. You think in the Old Testament, at the very time that God is meeting with his servant Moses on Mount Sinai, Israel experiences its most popular worship service in its history. The best attended worship service ever, where everybody became vigorously involved in the worship. And the music was so exciting that when they were up on the mountain, they thought that a war had broken out and that they were hearing the cries of battle. But when they looked, here it was, the people singing praise songs as they danced around a golden calf. They were religious. They were engaged. They were singing praises. They were enjoying themselves. And every minute were exposing themselves to the wrath of God, because they were not worshiping God as God had commanded them to worship him. That's what scares the liver out of me with what we call so-called experimental worship. I'm not convinced that all that there is to do properly in worship has been done in the past, and there's nothing we can learn as contemporary people about worship. I believe there is. Nor do I believe that the only music that's worthy of being used in the church is music that is old, and that you can't use any new music, because any music that we use in the church that was old at one time was new. So there's nothing wrong with it being new. The question is it appropriate? Does it honor God the way God seeks to be honored? You know, the only time in all of Scripture that the Bible speaks of God seeking something from his creatures is when Jesus speaks to the woman at the well and says, God is seeking people to worship him in spirit and in truth. And we need to take that very seriously. Now, back in 1996, I should say, at Cambridge, Massachusetts, right by Harvard University, 120 pastors and teachers of the churches gathered to consider the solas of the Reformation. This meeting was sponsored by ACE, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and they published a statement jointly from the Cambridge meeting called the Cambridge Declaration. And let me take a moment to read to you what the Cambridge Declaration said about Soli Deo Gloria. Sola Deo Gloria, the erosion of God-centered worship, wherein in the church biblical authority has been lost, Christ has been displaced, the gospel has been distorted, or faith has been perverted. It has always been for one reason. Our interests have displaced God's, and we are doing his work in our way. The loss of God's centrality in the life of today's church is common and lamentable. It is this loss that allows us to transform worship into entertainment, gospel preaching into marketing, believing into technique or methodology, being good into feeling good about ourselves, and faithfulness into being successful. As a result, God, Christ, and the Bible have come to mean too little to us and to rest too inconsequentially upon us. God does not exist to satisfy human ambitions or cravings or the appetite for consumption or our own private spiritual interests. We must focus on God in our worship rather than the satisfaction of our personal needs. How many times do you hear people say, well, I don't like to go to that church because I don't get anything out of it? When the purpose of Sunday morning gathering of the saints, beloved, is not evangelism. It may happen as a byproduct. The purpose is not fellowship. We hope that that happens as a consequence. But the single purpose of the assembling together of believers on the Sabbath is to worship God. In fact, the whole goal of your salvation is to bring you into a place where you worship God and that you honor Him as God. That's the point of your salvation. God is sovereign in worship. We are not. Our concern must be for God's kingdom, not our empires or our popularity or our success. And so here's the affirmation of Thesis 5. We reaffirm that because salvation is of God, has been accomplished by God, is for God's glory, that we must glorify Him always. We must live our entire lives before the face of God, under the authority of God, and for the glory of God alone. We have a segment always in Table Talk magazine called Coram Deo, which means before the face of God. That in everything we do, we are to give honor, ascribe glory to Him. We deny that we can properly glorify God if our worship is confused with entertainment, if we neglect God's law or the gospel in our preaching, or if in self-improvement, self-esteem, or self-fulfillment are allowed to become alternatives to the gospel. Now, we've gone through what's called a worship war in America, and it's been declared that the battle's over. And we minimize expository preaching. We minimize the music of the ages that exalts God, music that's been tested by time. We now discern worship according to age groups, and we want to make sure that whatever music we use is meaningful to this generation or the X generation, whereas in all of church history, the interesting thing about classical church music is that it was used by every generation. And my generation doesn't ask that church worship be determined by Benny Goodman, by bringing in the music of my era into the church. Rather, I want to know the music that Luther sang, that Ambrose sang, that Augustine used, the music that links and connects us to the church of all ages, because when we enter into worship on Sunday morning, we're entering into the heavenly sanctuary. We're involved in the communion of saints, where God is present, Christ is present, and the spirits of just men made perfect are also present. It's not just for us. And the great danger in our day is that we make us the center of concern. And we steal the glory of God. In salvation, in worship, in all that we do, the driving passion of the Christian must always be Soli Deo Gloria. To God alone